Video on Michael Flynn versus the FBI, and I just want to make this point. I'm aware of certain people that would watch that video and would say they have certain opinions of criminal justice and criminal justice reform, and this is a topic that I'm just going to keep returning to and pounding on it because it's something that a certain segment of the population is not examining, and they're making a certain sacrifice, and they should be aware that they are sacrificing their authenticity and their credibility. And I think I understand some of their reasons, but I think it's based out of a skepticism and not an optimism. So I'll put it this way. People look at criminal justice reform and they'll talk about how it disproportionately affects certain minorities and certain victim groups and this thing and that thing. But then when you look at General Flynn and what's been done to him by that institution, he's not somebody that is worthy of justice, one, because of power dynamics. That's number one. It's not the principle of the injustice itself. It's who is it being applied to. Now, some of that is kind of unavoidable because certain cases you're not going to hear about. And there's also these other dynamics of if somebody's in a position of power, how much should the consequences affect them, especially if we need them in their role, either because of their competence or because of their association with other people, they receive protection, and we will see that as being unjust. So the rules have to be applied consistently. And I understand that, and I understand that certain groups aren't going to receive the same advocacy, receive the same support that somebody in a position of power might receive. So I understand that. But if you are nakedly saying, and I've had people make these arguments to my face. I'll say, well, this is an injustice that happened to this CEO, and this was the reasoning, and I thought the reasoning was kind of bunk. And they said, I don't care because that is a powerful person. It's punching up, so they're not really worthy of my time to hear about what's happening to this poor multimillionaire, blah, 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 blah. And I'll talk to people, and you know what kind of person I'm talking about, that will say that to my face. And then they'll continue to make their moral appeals about this thing and this thing. And I go, you're already seated in skepticism. And so when you are trying to appeal to morality and principles, I said, well, didn't you discard that at the beginning of the conversation where you said, oh, well, that doesn't apply to that person because they have power? Or and this is where the power dynamics thing goes, you just assign a certain lingual territory to certain people like Donald Trump, and then all things become permissible because in imposing him, you are doing good. This is something that terrifies me. When people are not making decisions based on principle and they get to discard the principle and they get to look at, concerns that I think we all share where it's some kind of injustice where it's like, well, the principle was not applied uniformly here. Do you condemn this? And I would typically go, yeah, that's not fair, but like, what do you want me to do about it? I'm not going to join you in just dispensing with principle and calling everything arbitrary, and whatever you do to combat the injustice you see is now just. That's a dangerous way of thinking that I see a lot of people in this country finding to be acceptable. And they do it with Donald Trump. They do it with language like punching up and punching down. It's just very callous and short-sighted. Again, I've heard people say, and they're very progressive people, because I don't think I hear other people really making these claims. It's the people that pretend to be very moral and they're Pharisees. And so the letter of the law should serve them in what they want to do. And it doesn't seem justifiable to me, but they find ways of justifying it. And at the same time, they try to use principle and morals to say, the cause that I'm crying out about needs attention, but it's like, yeah, maybe, but you've already dispensed with your credibility because just the way that you view the world, some people are worthy of legal protections and other people are not, especially, and it's this pride in this sense of inversion where it's like, well, I am the champion of the poor and disenfranchised, and by denying justice to the rich and wealthy, I'm also doing a double justice. It's twice as good. And it's like, ew, gross, extremely arrogant. It's gleeful and prideful, and you're like, I have had conversations with people where they just don't see a problem with it because they have this gross. I think it has to do with their education. They're taught this power dynamic stuff in college. A lot of these are college educated people, or they pick it up from the college educated that this is the way that we should view justice. And usually it's not articulated as starkly as I've put it, because when you put it that way, it sounds distasteful. But that's because it is distasteful. And all the language games that are used to cover up for this is also very distasteful. So, again, I will refer to this case because there are the people that look at, oh, I am on the side of the disenfranchised and the broken, and they will willfully do injustice to people based on those sorts of perceptions, that there's categories of people and we don't need to treat them with the same principle. We can respect persons and call it justice. So the champions of the disenfranchised, I'll use the instance of anti-Semitism, and I've already used this as an example several times, but there were attacks against Jewish communities on the East Coast, in Brooklyn and New Jersey last year, particularly in December. There were several, and these were by and large committed by Black Hebrew Israelites, Nation of Islam. It was Black versus Jew. And the way that the progressive journalists framed this, in order to preserve the lingual territory, they said, these attacks are happening. And then these attacks are happening, and then the next sentence would say, white supremacy is on the rise. And it's like, well, what does that have to do with anything? What does that have to do with this article? Because these people are not white supremacists, but because that the dishonest way that they write it, and because they're more interested in their theory than in human lives, the punching up and punching down and preserving their role as the guardian of the broken and the disenfranchised, it's very condescending, it's very gross, it is racist, but these are the people that call everybody out for racist. They provide cover to anti-Semites in order to preserve the lingual territory, because you can't talk about Black people being racist because, power dynamics. They don't have the institutional power to do so. But they certainly can get a van and some guns and shoot up a synagogue. But then we're just going to say that that's white supremacy. Gross. But this is the kind of people that we're dealing with. And it's very difficult to reach them with language because they're so skeptical and cynical and enmeshed in their own bullshit that if they let go of their illusions, they have to come into contact with how they suffer for a lack of authenticity. And I think that's a painful realization that they want to avoid at all costs.